Hello everyone, Pete Mesling here. I thought it would be fun to do a couple of readings for you today. Give you one more thing to kill some time with while you're self-isolating, quarantining, working from home, whatever it is you're doing to get by. The first thing that I'd like to read is really kind of made up of multiple things, but it's very brief. It's a section that's slated to be in my forthcoming short story collection called Jagged Edges and Moving Parts. This little portion I call Microphasia, and it's made up of 140 character short stories that I originally wrote for Twitter back when that was their character limit. So this won't take long to get through this part. Then I'll read a short story, a longer, more traditional length short story for you, also from the Jagged Edges and Moving Parts collection. But let's start with Microphasia, see how this goes. At dawn, he collapsed in the desert. At noon, he died without pain. By dusk, the world had forgotten all about him. Now he simply had been. A heron and a man stared each other down. The man yearned to fly. The heron wanted nothing. No one heard the shotgun blast. Small worms burrowed into the webbed skin between her fingers and toes. Warm and content, they called for their brothers and sisters. Kemp counted the bundles of C-notes on his coffee table. A knock at the door. "It's open." No response. He went on counting, a bit faster. In the dark, wet earth beneath the stone, a wormy thing wriggled. Lindsay tried to pull it free, but it was rooted deep, and it pulled back. He has long known there is a space between the bathroom and coat closet down the hall, but today is his first time hearing the stifled sobs. Listening to his running bath, he wondered what her smile had meant. He recapped the empty pill bottle and stepped into the tub. Ah, warmth. The lizard had eaten a locust for breakfast, a spider for lunch, and a moth for supper. Did it possess their knowledge now? Tabitha grinned. I long to meet you in daylight and pretend not to recognize the way you twirl your hair in thought. You have wooed me in the dark, unaware. The statue came to life each night and wandered the streets in fear. Naked, cold, and alone, it yearned to be set free. Forever stone. I remain still, not wanting to know if my legs are pinned. Are my eyes closed, or is it really this dark? The gnashing is close now. The polished bear tooth reflected moonlight as he brought it to the man's throat. At last the animal would have revenge against its killer. Yesterday had the sore been on her left or right arm? The mirrors confused her. It had grown some, green under the purple now, infected. I stare into your eyes as I break open the fortune cookie. Satisfying until a horde of black ants crawls forth to carpet my hands and arms. She tells the stranger her name is Judith. He says. It's Lillian. She gets off 2 stops early and wonders if he might be right. So that was Microphasia from Jagged Edges and Moving Parts, which is a collection of mine that I hope will be coming out in the not-too-distant future, as they say. And then, again, also from that collection, I have a story opening the collection, in fact, is a story called The Things We Teach Our Young. And I'd like to read that for you now as well, and that will be the closer of this little session. Hope you're having a good time. The Things We Teach Our Young. The first thing Dennis noticed was that he couldn't see for shit. The second was that his face felt wet. His right hand brushed against his eyeglasses on the seat beside him. They were intact, so he slid them on. The trunk of a giant fir consumed most of the view through his decimated windshield, and when he looked down at his shirt front, all he saw was red. Even in a post-traumatic state, he was able to put 2 and 2 together. He'd fallen asleep while driving and damn near paid for it with his life. The steering wheel had clamped down on his right thigh, but he was able to wiggle his leg free by pressing himself into the seat and remove himself from the vehicle. Once outside, it became obvious that his Bronco would never take him away from it all again. It had breathed its last. He turned to look up toward the road. Extricating himself from the cab had been child's play compared to the climb he had in front of him if he wanted to reach the highway. But he did want to reach the highway, and climb he did, one agonizing step at a time. Twice he had to grip a branch of protruding foliage to get past a particularly steep patch, and dizziness almost sent him reeling more than once, but he made it to the top in one piece. When he got to the roadside, he looked back down into the ravine and saw that his two-toned white and tan bronco must have rolled several times before having its clock stopped by the aged fir. It looked as if a giant had begun crushing the rugged vehicle in its fist, only to be called away before he could complete the job. It was not lost on Dennis that he could have ended up in worse shape himself. Much worse. The night was dry and clear, accented more than lit by a crescent moon that hung at a lazy distance from the treetops. He'd never hitchhiked a day in his life, but what other options did he have? Patting his pockets, he'd realized his phone was nowhere on his person. He glanced into the ravine again. No way was he climbing back down to grope around for his phone, which probably wouldn't draw a signal out in these woods even if he did find it. He began walking slowly along the shoulder, but really he was listening for a vehicle, and if one came from the direction he was walking in, he'd want to hustle across to the other side before it reached him. Before long, lights arced around a bend at his back, washing the road ahead of him from right to left. The sound of the engine was next. Something fairly big, a truck probably. Hope swelled within him. It must get pretty lonely on the road when you're a trucker, he figured. Maybe luck was on his side now that it had had its fun with him. His mind tried to tell his arm to hail the driver, but something didn't connect. Instead, he stopped and turned toward the vehicle bearing down on him, and he hoped he looked more pathetic than frightening. For a horrible moment, he feared the truck was going to pass him by, roll around the bend 50 yards up the road, and disappear into the night, the diminishing roar of its engine a taunt. But as though imagining the worst had produced a talismanic effect against it becoming his fate, the truck pulled onto the shoulder just beyond where it stood. It was a 6-wheel box truck that had seen better days. Nothing on the rear gate indicated what it was hauling or who it belonged to, but some slow-working part of his brain thought there had been a faded logo on the side panel. Not that it mattered. He needed a lift in a bad way. Any risk in sharing a cab with a stranger was small spuds compared to the risk of waiting for the next passerby. He wasn't sure he'd make it much longer without medical attention. A chill was on him, despite the pleasant summer night, and his left side hurt more than he liked. Was there also a slight tremble in his hands? He was damn sure thirsty, and that could become a serious problem before anything else did. He shuffled toward the truck on feet like cinder blocks. The logo hadn't been a figment of his imagination. Ernie's Heating and Cooling Services was emblazoned on the side, accompanied by the image of a sly little fucker tipping his hat like he'd just kissed your mom on the mouth and was daring you to make something of it. When Dennis pulled open the passenger door, the dome light illuminated a driver with dark skin, maybe 30 years old, maybe younger. The man didn't look in his direction. There was an impatient air to the way he sat there gripping the steering wheel and staring out the windshield. "I've run into a spot of trouble," Dennis said. "I can see that," the driver responded, still looking straight ahead. "Hop in. I could do with some company. I'll get you to the nearest hospital. Your car go off the road?" "Thanks, I appreciate it." "Yeah, let myself fall asleep at the wheel." He hauled himself into the cab, but it took every ounce of strength he had. "The accent, is that Arabic?" The man nodded. "I'm from Damascus originally, studied in London. The name is Akram." Finally he turned and gave Dennis a weak smile. Dennis pulled the heavy door shut, and then silence reigned between them as Akram guided the truck back onto the road and coaxed it through its gears to full speed. "Do you have a name?" Akram asked. "Yeah, I have a name." He thought about leaving it there, but decided to keep things civil. Just because he had opinions didn't mean he had to share them with every Jim, Tim, and Slim he came across. Or every Akram. Dennis. "I don't have a phone, no CB either. A ride is going to have to do it." "Yeah, look, like I said, I appreciate the help, but I'm tired and beat up. I'm really not in for a lot of conversation." "There are some wipes in the glove box for your face. Ribs giving you some trouble, too? It looked like a piece of work climbing into the cab. Your hand hasn't left your side since you got in, either." "Yeah, it hurts some." With his free hand, Dennis popped open the glove box and fished around until he felt what must have been the package of wipes. As he pulled it free, the back of his hand brushed against something hard. Peering in, he saw that it was a phone, face up in a thick protective case. His gut clenched a little at the odd incongruity, but he kept his mild concern to himself. Could have been a defunct phone, or maybe Akram had forgotten it was there. No big deal. He closed the glove box and rubbed drying blood from his face and neck with some of the wipes, every movement coming with difficulty now. It didn't seem like the pain of a broken rib that kept his left hand at his side. It was more like a rib was poking at something deeper. Christ, how far were they from Seattle? 20 minutes? 40? Are you going to take the back roads all the way in? I think I'm in some trouble here. Finishing up with the wipes, he balled them up and dropped them into a trash can weighted down on the floor between driver and passenger with a sandbag attachment at the bottom. Then he tossed the package into a recess on the dashboard. Back in the glove box, please, Akram said. What? The wipes. Put them back in the glove box, where you found them. 20 years ago you wouldn't have been able to talk to me like that. You mean because you're white and I'm not? It wasn't a question. Basically. Plus, I'm a true American. You said yourself you're from Damascus. Dennis noticed the truck was accelerating. Look, you're getting upset. Let's slow this rig down and act like adults. Once you drop me off at the medical center, we'll never have to see each other again. Put the fucking wipes back where they belong. Time stretched until Dennis returned the wipes to the glove box. And then it stretched again as both men sat in strained silence. After several moments, Dennis felt the truck settle to a more reasonable speed, and his breathing relaxed in turn. I apologize, Akram said. It's just that I have certain standards of order. You've helped me out, and I'm thankful for it. Dennis's mind turned back to the phone in the glove box. But I don't need to be your problem. Why don't you let me out, and I'll catch another ride? You wouldn't last an hour on your own. You'll find bottles of water under the seat. It was the one thing that could have mollified Dennis in that instant. He reached down and retrieved a bottle. With some effort, he unscrewed the lid, which was worth every pang once the water passed his lips and cascaded over his dry tongue and down his throat. So, Akram said, are you one of these white nationalist types? Dennis gave a scoffing chuckle. I'm not afraid of the truth, Akram said. Yeah, I guess maybe I am. Does that offend you? No. If anything, it bores me. Racism is such a tired retreat. What about you? I assume you're a Muslim. Of course. Not exactly a religion of inclusiveness, is it? What do you mean by that? Well, your obsession with infidels, the way you oppress women and gays. How do you feel about women and gays, Dennis? Oh, fuck off. Don't go comparing yourself to me. Do you put faggots above Muslims? I sure as hell don't want to stone them to death or throw them off towers or whatever you people do. But I suppose you'd be happy to bomb Muslims from the face of the earth. Terrorists, yeah. Ah, terrorism. Such a mystery to Westerners. How else are poor Middle Eastern countries supposed to wage war against their powerful oppressors? They don't have navies and air forces. The last thing Dennis wanted to waste his draining energy on was a political debate with a social justice warrior, so he let it drop. Both men fell into a kind of shared meditation. Dennis sensed that Akram didn't really want to pursue the matter any more than he did. In an effort to keep from giving voice to more angry thoughts, it was as if they silently agreed to content themselves with the lulling sound of tires humming across blacktop, their vision reduced to what was illuminated by the truck's merged cones of light, which guided them through the dark. Getting to Bayview Medical Center before Dennis lost consciousness, or worse, was the only goal that mattered. He was nearly asleep when Akram mentioned a plan to connect with I-90, which would put them on a straight shot to the hospital. His head bobbed a few times, and he was out. Dennis stands in the center of a wind-blown desert village. He is a boy, or made to feel like one. He is handed a gun, given rudimentary instructions on how to use it, and told to go practice with it until afternoon prayers. There will come a time when he will need every weapon at his disposal to fight back against the infidel oppressors of the West. Who is my enemy, he asks. The whole world is your enemy, he is told. He takes several steps, then turns. The man who gave him the gun and the answer to his question is clad in desert attire and is walking away. "Father!" he calls out. The man turns around. Dennis lifts his weapon and takes aim. "Die like a dog, infidel!" The man waves his arms and opens his mouth wide to yell something back, but bullets rip through his chest and abdomen before he can utter a syllable. Each red hole seeps through the cotton fabric of his robe before he drops to the sand, lifeless and mute. Someone is hollering in Arabic. Dennis hears the bark of rubber on pavement, but there's no pavement in the desert. Pain at his side. Did he shoot himself when he shot his father? Wait, his father wasn't an Arab. He didn't grow up in a desert. He was... His eyes flashed open, his heart thumping, as if two strong men were at it with alternating hammer blows. Still, the sound of Arabic at high volume. Something like Arabic, anyway. Why did nothing look familiar through the windshield? Slowly the world came back into focus. They had arrived in Seattle, and the city streets were a jarring contrast to the mountain roads they'd left behind. But they would have had to pass the trauma center to get to this part of downtown, wouldn't they? He looked over at Akram, the source of the strange litany. The man's features were altered by anger, the likes of which Dennis wasn't sure he'd ever seen before. Then he realized it wasn't anger. It was hatred that drew Akram's brow down between his deep-set eyes and pulled his cheeks taut across the bone beneath as he continued his high-pitched chanting. They rounded onto a flat stretch of roadway. The financial district loomed over them, but it was difficult to make out their exact location. It didn't help that Dennis's vision was dialing in and out of focus. A flash of blue between buildings. Again and again. Water. They were down by the piers, Alaskan way. The truth erupted like a flare in his brain. How could he have been so stupid? It was the third night of a summer music festival on one of the piers. His son had been talking about taking in some of the acts. There would be hundreds of revelers milling about, even in this late hour. The box truck accelerated and skidded into a turn, like a torpedo finding its trajectory. Akram's ululations intensified. Nearly tipping the truck onto its outside wheels, Akram gave the steering wheel one good crank and guided the vehicle, weapon, onto the pier. Dennis felt helpless to do anything more than observe. A vague awareness of danger spread across his face, or rather across the faces of those nearest the entrance to the pier. If he didn't do something to stop this, dozens might die by the time Akram reached the far edge of the platform. One of them could be his own son. The first mass of people was less than 20 yards away. There was no way to avoid hitting all of them unless... He reached across the cab and clamped his hand over the horn. The sound it made was weaker than he'd hoped, and the pain at his side bloomed up into his chest and almost paralyzed him, but he didn't let go. With his other hand, he forced the wheel, against Akram's considerable strength, and aimed for a gap between a hot dog vendor and the stage, which was awash in the flickering purples, blues, reds, and greens from the lighting rig. Dennis could hear music now, too, bass and drums, bass and drums. For a moment he thought he might actually pull this off without killing a soul, but he had wrenched the wheel as far off course as he was able, and it wasn't enough. The middle-aged man behind the hot dog stand was locked in place, staring with horror into the eyes of death as it roared his way. He wanted to move. Dennis could see it in his bulging eyes. If the man had ever asked for death, he didn't want it now. But it wanted him, and it got him. There was no way he could have survived the tumult as they crashed into the stand and slammed into the piling that also ended their progress. Dennis was in a lot of pain, but he seemed to be intact. Akram was in worse shape. His head had struck the driver's side window hard enough to spiderweb it and paint it red. Good, Dennis thought. He hoped the son of a bitch would live long enough to wake up in agony, then croak, regretting every fucking minute of his life. A more pressing concern, however, was how to proceed without getting gunned down as a suspected terrorist himself. Already he could hear sirens swarming down the hill. Best to stay put, he figured, and do as they instruct once they arrive. He only hoped they'd rush him to the hospital without asking a bunch of questions. Maybe he had the fortitude to tell his story once, before fatigue and blood loss claimed him for the night, but not more than that. Better to inform the Bayview nurses, who might actually use some of the details to help keep him alive, than a bunch of inquisitive cops who only wanted to clear the scene. The smell was unmistakable. He knew where he was before he opened his eyes. It's not like he'd spent a lot of time in hospitals, but the masking, sterile odor that hadn't changed since he was a boy, hospitalized for complications stemming from an appendectomy. He'd smelled it again when his mother had been laid up after being mugged. The same chemical reek. His mind grasped for reality, like hands on the rungs of a ladder. Why had the bastard bothered to pick him up? Had he wanted company? Not likely. Dennis figured it had more to do with peppering the game, adding a layer of complication to the investigation, and a layer of fear to the public's reception. But he knew that if you started trying to apply reason to the actions of madmen, you risked your own sanity in the process. "Mr. Hobson?" It was a female voice, comforting. He turned his head and saw the nurse who had rescued him from his own thoughts. Maybe 25, no more than 30. Akram's age. She wore her light brown hair neatly trimmed, and there wasn't a wrinkle to be seen on her spotless attire. Her smile was pleasant and credible. "That's..." He coughed and took some water through a straw. "That's my name. Don't..." More coughing. "Wear it out? I won't. There's someone who'd like to see you, if you're up for it." "Cops?" "No, they'll wait. But your son seems pretty anxious for a visit." "Tony?" He pulled himself up a bit. "I'll be damned. Is he alone?" "Yes, sir." "Sir yet." "Okay, send him in." "Hey, Pop," Tony said, striding into the room. He was trying to play it like all of this was no big deal. Dennis had seen the walk and the attitude 1,000 times before. "How's it hanging, Toenail?" The nurse smiled and left them alone. "Like an anchor in the deep." Dennis laughed until he coughed, then took another sip of water. "I don't think you've ever given the same answer twice." "I'm only 16. Give me time." 16. Jesus, when did that happen? Yesterday you were hauling boogers out of your nose and wiping them on your pants. The ones you didn't eat, anyway. Tony snickered a little. "Hey, Pop, you really showed that snack bar the time of day, didn't you? They're calling you a hero. 1 down, couple billion to go, ain't that right?" "No, that ain't right. Why don't you come over here and have a seat, son?" Tony did as he was told. "You think I did what I did because he was a Muslim? I stopped him because he was a killer." "Ain't no difference. You said so yourself." Dennis blanched because he knew it was true. He'd said that, and worse. "Listen, I got to know a little bit about our friend Akram. At first I had him pegged as kind of a bigot. Then he started coming off like a goddamn SJW. Tony laughed at that, glad to hear a little of his dad's old self. "Well, the truth is, I could have lived with either of those. Not pleasant characteristics, maybe, but not worth getting in a fist fight over either. You see what I mean, son?" "I guess I don't. I don't expect it to come to you all at once. Hell, I just about had to be knocked into tomorrow to get it through my thick skull. But I've been feeding you a lot of anger, boy. Anger at a lot of stuff it ain't worth being angry at. See, as long as Akram was just a Muslim truck driver willing to help me out of a tough spot, we were 2 men cut from different cloth, that's all. But as soon as I realized what he really was, I also realized what he wasn't. That make any sense?" "Son of a bitch, Dad, I don't know. Look, I don't want you going through life hating and fearing everyone who's different from you. That sort of thinking just breeds more of the same. And just like the streets ain't filled with serial killers and rapists, they ain't overrun with terrorists either. I know it's not a perfect comparison, but it's something for you to think on. Can you do that for me? Can you think on these things?" "Yeah, I guess." The boy was troubled by the change in his father, that was clear. But Dennis figured he'd come around. He wished he could take back about 1,000 things he'd said over the years, but Tony was young and sharp. He'd see that there was more than one way to take in the world yet. If it could happen to a whipped old bugger like Dennis, it could sure as hell happen to his boy. Maybe it could happen to just about anyone. He reached over and tousled his son's unruly mop of hair, but Tony pulled away. "Gotta go, Pop. Meeting up with some friends." Dennis watched Tony closely, trying to gauge his son's body language. Were his words sinking in as the boy stepped out of the room and left his father to his recovery? Or were they breaking up against the wall Tony carried around with him and tumbling down to the floor unheeded? Hard to say, as with just about everything else in life, and also like most things in life, only time would tell. Hopefully Tony would be listening when it did. Dennis closed his eyes and did his best to get some sleep. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed yourself. I did. That was fun. and take care through this trying time. All the best.